In the first place, the idea in that Amatadus, the dilemma for ghost, Ato's family becomes something of a taboo family because people say, oh, this woman's son has gone to America to marry a descendant of a slave. Because of the stigma attached to the history of slavery, people do not want to relate on any good terms with this girl. So the legacy of slavery is lodged in the collective unconscious in a way in which it creates a certain barrier between Africa and the African diaspora. Now, when you go to the second book, The Return, again, as the title suggests, it is about an African-American business tycoon who, on a business trip somewhere, has his plane crash in some jungle somewhere, and again, a very thin disguise for the middle part of Africa, particularly the Ashanti region, and then is captured by some natives and is supposed to be executed or something. But then he is able to escape, goes back home, narrates the story to elders in his family, and based on that, they tell him, look, where your plane crashed is your home. And the story goes that a prince was sold into slavery, and when he was going, a diviner said that prince will return by whatever means. Whether it took 100 years or whatsoever, he returned. And that by some supernatural power, whatever, that is his home. So now he decides to return home. He comes, tells his story, and the people around him believe him that yes, in the dim collective or communal memory, there was a story like that of a prince who was sold into slavery, and a diviner at the time. So he is installed a king with all his entitlements and whatsoever. And again, people have criticized this work because it simplifies the whole idea of repatriation. This whole idea of people coming back and then quickly recognized and made, in this case, even a traditional ruler. And people have drawn attention to people of African descent who have come to Ghana, for instance, and are crowned just ceremonial chiefs. We've had Steve Wonder, made chief, some other African Americans, and people think that, yes, that's just as far as it goes. Beyond that, there is nothing to it. At any rate, this guy who is made chief quickly goes back to America, and that's it. And Steve Wonder is back in America anyway. So it throws up this whole debate of how difficult or how easy it is for this noble idea of reconnection with the African diaspora, or the linking up of the African diaspora with the motherland, the continent. You come to Ayikwema's Osiris rising, which is actually based on the ancient Egyptian myth of Isis and Osiris. Again, we have an African American intellectual, a young woman who studied history and decides to leave that history by way of coming to Africa, escaping from what she felt at the time was discrimination, all the things that African Americans suffer, and then comes to Africa with the idea of changing the continent in concert with intellectuals thinking like her that, look, this continent can become a very great continent if we have intellectuals come together to change things. So she goes to work in a fictional university known as the University of Manda. And what they try to do is to change the continent of Africa right at the intellectual level, what people are taught in Africa, in schools, in universities. And they target three main areas: history, literature, and politics. Yes. And history, what they do is to try to retrieve it from the stranglehold of the Greco-Roman Academy, that Africa's history is an appendix to some other history. And in fact, a very, very renowned British historian, Hugh Trevor Roper, as recently as 1963, gave a lecture in Oxford where he said, there was no history in Africa. The only history of Africa is the history of Europe in Africa. So this woman tries to help change this whole idea. Study African history from the perspective of Africans. Africans writing their own history, telling their own stories. Literature, again, going back to African oral literature or literature written by Africans, blah, 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 and then they go on and on. But then she finds that she is a bit idealistic because she comes from this idea to work with people and finds out that the people she's working with, most of them are trained in the West and are so steeped in the things that they want to change. So she becomes frustrated, like Eulalie Rush in The Dilemma of a Ghost. Am I in the right place? Am I in the wrong place? But what happens is that along the line, she gets into an amorous relationship with one of the so-called revolutionaries and is pregnant by the time she's about to leave, but there's some misunderstanding and she's shot and killed. No, her husband is shot and killed and she has to flee back to the US. But she says she will be back because of the child she's carrying at the time. So what we have, I want to end on this note, on a note of the poem titled Heritage by the African American County Caleb. And this poem was written in 1925. And I argue in this paper that the issues raised by County Caleb in Heritage are as relevant in 1925 as they are today. And the poem goes like this: what is Africa to me? Copper sun or scarlet sea, jungle star or jungle track, strong bronzed men or regal black women from whose loins I sprang. 1 centuries removed from the scenes his father loved, spicy grove, cinnamon tree. What is Africa to me? And the question continues. The question lingers. What is Africa to those in the African diaspora? But the reverse will also be, what is the African diaspora to people on the African continent? Do they see the other half of Africa on the other side of the Atlantic as brothers and sisters? Thank you very much.
Let's give a big hand to Dr. Ajay and Dr. Kambon. I know that we probably have a lot of questions. I myself have a couple of questions, so just wanted to kickstart our Q&A session off. We talked a lot about the transatlantic slave trade and the import of understanding this relationship with African peoples in the diaspora. So I'm wondering, there are 62 slave forts here in Ghana, What is the import of slavery here for Ghanaians? There are a lot of scholars, Ann Bailey, Sadia Hartman, Paula Ebron, who talk about the presence or absence of conversations about enslavement here in Ghana. Ann Bailey calls it lingering whispers. So I wanted to know, how are we understanding this today in our context?
Yeah, there is something in this whole debate about slavery and its legacies and what people call collective amnesia. That is that kind of amnesia that is self-inflicted. People, for some convenience, wanting to pretend that slavery never happened. Let's just forget about it. And it's not only here on the African continent. It is there in African diaspora as well. There are some Africans in the diaspora who do not want to set foot on African soil anymore because of the pain that still lingers. But there are others who say, look, let's go progress. And you should follow people to Cape Coast Castle or Emina Castle and see the different emotions that run through different people. There are people from the African diaspora who go to Cape Coast Castle, and it's a very, I don't know how to put it, the kind of emotion that they go through. But for some people, they just take it in their stride. Oh, this was the point at which we were sold, and I'll come back again and again. Because this has become a kind of grotto. This is a hallowed ground. This is a sacred place. This was where my ancestors were sold into slavery. I cannot deny it. I gave a lecture on slavery to a group of students from Rutgers University some time ago. And they were making reference to the slave forts. And I said, you cannot deny history. One day you must tell generations yet unborn what those castles stand for. And I drew an analogy between the slave forts and the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Now look, that Leaning Tower was not built to be leaning. It was a piece of civil engineering gone wrong. But the Italians are proud of that monument. Did you understand me? So, this idea of people not wanting to talk about slavery, I did a bit of research. In my area, my traditional area, southern Volta Anglo area, I have a collection of slave proverbs and slave songs that people still sing in shrines and for some ritual purposes. It is not as if people don't want to talk about slavery. It is not as if issues about slavery do not reside in our folklore or our tradition. They are there. People know it. And there are people of slave ancestry in some families today, and they are proud to say, my father or my great-grandfather was a slave. I am bearing this name because I was bought by this and this and this and this. So, I'm just saying that we can continue talking about slavery, but because slavery is a very passionate subject, sometimes there's an overdose of sentimentality, and people dwell much more on the sentimental side than the slavery aspect itself. So the debate will continue from all kinds of perspectives.
Ago. The call and response makes sure that you are not sleeping. I saw a few people who started to wake up. So I teach at University of Ghana, and I teach Intro to African Studies. And what I find is that I start off with a needs assessment. So I start asking the students, what do they know about Africa in general? And what I find is that there's very little knowledge about anything to do with African people at the 200 level. So let's try it here. Has anyone here heard of Shakespeare? By show of hands, don't be shy. You've heard of Shakespeare? Okay. Has anyone ever heard of the author of the oldest book in the world? One, two. It's an African, by the way. Can anyone tell me that person's name? Batautet, very good. This is how you know that Silla is an African studies with me. Okay, so that's one. This is an example of what I do with the students, right? Now, the author of the oldest book in the history of the world, that's a very important fact to know. But we know about Shakespeare, we don't know about the author of the oldest book in the history of the world. Before Chinese, before Mesopotamia, before anything else. But we don't know that one. Then I asked them, all right, have you heard of Einstein? All the hands go up. Let's try this. Has anyone ever heard of Albert Einstein? Okay. Has anyone ever heard of the world's first multi-genius? And can anyone tell me that person's name? Imhotep, very good. I don't know if it's because he was at the event last week, or he already knew. That Patah he knew from last week. Imhotep you already knew. Wonderful. Good. So, this is when I'm talking about do people know or what do people know, that I'm always asking students, and then we start going into the image of Africa that they see. It's upside down. The image you see everywhere in the AU, on t-shirts, everywhere, that's an upside down Africa. The oldest map in the history of the world was also made right here in Africa, and it was a south up map, where in the Nile Valley, the word for east was the same as the word for left. The word for west was the same as the word for right. The word for south was up, and the word for north was down. So anytime you see a map, the map you're looking at is upside down. I ask people, do they know this information? It's the Turin Papyrus map. You can Google it right now. You'll see this is the oldest map. So who changed it and why? But this is information that you would think people in Africa should know, that the oldest map in the world is from Africa, but we don't know this. So I'm coming to your question. So now when we're starting to go into the nuances about enslavement and how much do they know, they can tell you about the Magna Carta. But then you start asking them, do you know Jean-Jacques Dessalines? And then you get big question marks. You ask them, do they know Napoleon? All the hands go up. Maybe that was the spirit of Dessalines mad that you don't know his name. So Dessalines is the one who defeated Napoleon, right? And infamously or famously or wonderfully stated, coupe tête, brûle cat, which translates to cut head, burn house, right? So this is somebody who we don't know the name, but we know the loser. Now when we think about the end of enslavement, within 1 year of Britain going into Haiti and getting their butts whooped to the tune of 12,000 of them killed, that is, within 1 year they decided to end the importation of enslaved Africans to the Western Hemisphere. Because what they realized from a strategic military perspective is that every ship that comes is reinforcements for the Africans who are whooping that behind in the first place. So there's a direct cause and effect correlation between getting their butts whooped and within 1 year they say stop importing. Then come to 1831, 1832, you have the Samuel Sharp Rebellion in Jamaica, where again they got their butts whooped. And within 1 week of them finally suppressing that rebellion, they got a committee together to talk about how to end enslavement altogether. This is cause and effect. African people who are putting it to them, because we understood that to really show Black Lives Matter, you have to enforce that. But when you do this against Black lives, this is what we do in retaliation. So, all of this is to say we don't know enough. What we have here in Ghana and in Africa in general and throughout the African world are systems of miseducation, that's being told the wrong thing, diseducation, that's not being told anything, and anti-education, which is the opposite of what we would expect education to do. So even to get into the nuances of, even when we talk about the terms, when we say castles instead of dungeons, when we say slave trade instead of genocidal, forced migration. So we say intolerance otuko. So intolerance is genocide, and chi otuko is a forced migration, right? So even the terms that we use is like Middle Passage. It sounds like I'm on a cruise ship. You understand? So all of these things need, definitely attention, and it needs to start from the curriculum from young, because what we're doing is we're trying to repair broken adults instead of building strong children. So the children grow up without it. They know Magna Carta. They know every white person who ever lived. They don't know any of the most important human beings ever to walk the face of the planet, because those are African people.
So today we're celebrating Ghana's 60th anniversary of independence. And some may find it ironic that we're also having this conversation.
Is that noise from this mic? Switch.
Conversation.
Let's switch mics and see if it's coming from this one.
On slavery, on neo-slavery, on repatriation, and the myth of Africa's past. We're also surrounded by paintings done by Efosela, looking at this concept of hunter-hunted and exploring Black resistance movements across the continent. So we seem to have a very firm understanding of what enslavement is. Do we also understand or can find routes towards freedom? I'm wondering if you have anything to say towards that.
I think it's because you're close to the speaker. I think it's from this location.
Thank you. I think the best route is education. Dr. Badali just talked about miseducation and diseducation. We have a very peculiar situation in Ghana and Africa, for that matter, where the history or our history was written for us by the perpetrator society for the victim society. Do you understand what I'm saying? Until recently, the history of slavery was the one told by the enslavers. But fortunately, there's a new wave of African writing from the African perspective. Africans are beginning to tell their own stories. But it appears that we haven't gone far enough. I teach English literature. Fortunately, just last week, I taught something on Olaora Ekwenu's travels. We were trying to interrogate it from all kinds of angles, whether he wrote that himself or it was written for him, whether Ekwenu is a sellout to the establishment at the time or what. And it was very interesting, the different perspectives and angles from which the students were answering this question. I grew up believing that Olaora Ekwenu is an African hero. But a new literature that is counter literature, if you like, that is emerging about Olaora Ekwenu is pointing in a different direction. So people are becoming more discerning about the history of slavery, and what needs to be done is for the story of slavery to be part of our educational system, to be taught by African historians from the African perspective, even as we try to kind of treat it as a taboo subject. It must. There is this Ghanaian known as Jacobus Capitaine. I don't know if anybody has. He was a slave sold to some whatever missionaries or something in Holland, and he was, I think, one of the first African people of African descent to have been educated to the PhD level, and his PhD dissertation was on slavery. He was actually commissioned by his supervisors to write a dissertation that eulogizes, glorifies slavery, and one of the reasons being that courtesy slavery, he had been able to be civilized, get an education all the way, and that dissertation became a classic in Europe at the time. And the best scholars at the time were making reference to that work Look, we said it, that Negroes benefited more from slavery than they suffered. Here is one of them. That is why Olaudah Ekwenu's book has that long, convoluted title, The Interesting Narrative of Olaudah Ekwenu, the African, Olaudah Ekwenu or Gustavus Vassa, the African, written by himself. And I keep posing the question, do you think he wrote this book? So, I think the best route to emancipation is through education. The kind of education we received for a very long time is mis and diseducation, because our own people have not been proactive enough in designing for us the kind of history that demystifies the story from the perspective of the perpetrator society.
Last week we had the AU Deputy Chair, the new AU Deputy Chair, that's Thomas Kwesi Kwate at the Institute of African Studies. And he spoke about several things, but he was dealing with enslavement. And there's even a reason why we prefer to say enslaved Africans over slaves. Is anyone familiar with why? Is there a difference between saying the slaves versus the enslaved Africans? Anyone? Please.
Because to call somebody a slave is to attribute a lifelong identity to them, but to talk about enslaved Africans means that there's a perpetrator of a situation and it's talking about a condition.
Exactly.
A political or economic condition.
Exactly.
Which can also change.
Exactly.
So it gives also the option for transformation.
Exactly. And I often hear people say this. Thank you very much. Let's give her a round of applause. So sometimes you even hear people say things that are like tautologies, like when the slaves were in Africa, or after the slaves were free, yes, there's freed slave. And it's like, even when you're out of it, even when you're not in it, you're still, you understand? So when we say these are Africans who are in a temporary condition that they are willing to do things to get out of, then we're getting to the root of what we're dealing with. Now, in terms of his talk, what I found profound is that he gave very vivid details of the White Lives Matter movement. And the White Lives Matter, is anyone familiar with this movement? White Lives Matter? Yes, it's still a movement, but at that time it was really in full swing. And it was talking about how when this black was killed a white, what they did is that they strung him up, they brought him down, they cut his heart out of his chest, they cut the parts of the heart into 300 pieces and forced the other Africans to eat the parts of that heart. That's the White Lives Matter movement. They're saying if you kill one white, this is what is going to happen to all of you. I was looking at another documentary. We showed a film festival. We were looking at Wangari Maathai, and in it, she was talking about as the Kenyans or at that time, the Africans from various ethnic groups, one white man was killed in a village. So they sent the British in with guns to shoot every man and woman and only leave the children. And they left the children not out of any kindness, but those are the ones who are going to carry the message of what? White Lives Matter. So if you kill one, this is retribution. And they even had the White Flags Matter movement, where they had put a Dutch flag on the seashore, and a fancy man came and tore the flag up. So what they did to him was they cut the head off, they put the head on a pole for everyone to see, and this is before subjecting him to all types of torture. This is the White Flags Matter movement. So I was thinking about doing a project, and perhaps with Efo he would be up for this type of thing, what the Black Lives Matter movement can learn from the White Lives Matter movement. How did they teach you that white lives matter? That was a lesson that Africans still have held on to this day, that, I can rob somebody black, better not go to the white neighborhood. I can do this. If you do this to me and step on my sneaker, the vengeance is straight up. But if whites do it, I better go put up a signboard and say, let my people go, we shall overcome, blah, blah, blah. All of that is the effects of the White Lives Matter movement. But you've had Africans who have engaged method in terms of showing that Black Lives Matter, because the only way that we've ever shown that is when, like in Jamaica, like in Haiti, you know, what Ida B. Wells Barnett said is anytime they come with a lynch mob, you better have your shotgun, because the only time that they believe that Black Lives Matter is when they know that if they come for one, we're taking two. So this is the real, you know, Black Lives Matter movement. So I think recent examples like Gavin Long, like Micah X. Johnson, like before that, Mark Essex, like Colin Ferguson, like Dessalines, like all the Africans who are willing to really show that Black Lives Matter, that's the lesson. So we think that these Eurasians, they understand French, we think they understand Portuguese, we think they understand English. They don't understand any of those languages. What they understand is the language that they speak in and that they have taught us in. So that's what I think would be the way to make something happen, just in terms of those things. Thank you.
So now we're going to open it up to questions in the audience. And what we're going to do is take about 4 or 5 at a time. So please keep your question brief. Any questions for Dr. J and Dr. Kumbo?
Thank you to both of you for the history and the memory. And I was sitting, listening to it and then noting how I felt. Because this afternoon we went to the Nkrumah Memorial to see both the sculpture that's there, that's an installation, these heads in the grass. And then also we went into the museum and of course to his grave. And the feeling in my body was one of mourning, in a way also for a certain ideal or ethical universe that I think Nkrumah and his wife in that moment in history and the liberation leaders of Ghana and the citizens and the Ghanaians who supported that liberation felt at that time, which I think we collectively don't feel so much anymore, a certain ethical position on the economy, on our independence, etc. But so when you guys were talking, I felt a lot of mourning, I felt the trauma. And I worked a lot in violence in my life. I work in women's rights and I've worked confronting a lot of violence. And so I was interested in the piece about resistance because at least for me, if I only remember the violation, it actually at some point starts to emotionally incapacitate me because I start to feel like there's no way out. And so I wondered if you could actually speak a bit more about resistance, because the resistance has been so diverse, and it has been so incredible over time, and it's been so beautiful, and it continues. And so I'd just be interested also, because I know both of you, I mean the resistance has been heavy in African literature, and in fact a lot of us learned the resistance through reading the literature. And also the resistance was very present, as you were mentioning, in all of the slave rebellions and the micro-resistances and the, Haiti actually claiming its state very early on, etc. So I wondered, I would sort of like to hear a little bit more about the resistance part.
Okay. I don't know how many, again I'm speaking from a literature perspective. I don't know how many of you are conversant with South African-born Ghanaian writer Manu Hepstein's book, Ama, The Story of the Atlantic Slave Trade. It won the 2002 Commonwealth Prize in Literature. It's about 400 pages. It's a story from the beginning to the end about resistance to slavery, from the point of capture through the hinterland all the way to Cape Coast Castle, through the Middle Passage, all the way to Brazil. Is one epic story of resistance. So I would say that this idea of resisting slavery in all its manifestations is always there. But then you talk about liberation, you mentioned Nkrumah. I can tell you that within the African community, there are those who want liberation, But then there are some people who are still steeped in what we call mental slavery for some personal or collective gain or whatever. And mental slavery is much more destructive than chattel slavery or the transatlantic slavery because it is lodged permanently in the subconscious. It becomes a psychoanalytic kind of fixation. And that one is very difficult to fight. In America, for instance, I'm naming people shedding their slave names. It is a way of fighting against slavery. But here in Africa, I think it's the reverse. People discarding their names and taking on the colonizer's name. It's a form of mental slavery. Like the pastor said the other time that millions of Africans have died eating fufu because they don't eat fufu with cutlery or that kind of thing. I think that is straight from mental slavery because you are taking on somebody's culture in its totality. You are not so the fight or resistance is at different levels. But even as some segments of society, like Nkrumah and others, are fighting against slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, on the other side of the divide, there are those who want to perpetuate the regime of slavery in all kinds of certain ways. And Nkrumah was a victim. All Pan-Africanists were victims. So it's not a smooth ride to total liberation. It's a struggle. It will continue to be a struggle. That's the way I see it. Okay.
Last Emancipation Day, I gave a talk at Jamrock, that's in East Legon, on the Africans who emancipated themselves, where I went through all the various, not all, but hundreds of rebellions that Africans did and free republics in the Western Hemisphere. So looking at Africans like Gaspar Yanga in Mexico, is anyone familiar? By show of hands. All right. So this is an African who had a free republic in what's now modern day Mexico in the 1500s. And then also Zumbi dos Palmares, I hope we know this one. Brazil, very good. So this is in the 1600s. We can go to Haiti, we can go on and on. But in this, what you see is the resistance, and you see that the progress that we've made has been made because of, again, when we're really telling you that Black Lives Matter and showing you and demonstrating that to you, that Black Lives Matter, when they get that lesson, that's where they start to behave accordingly. So in terms of the resistance, I would point you to that one, and there are so many other ones, other scholars who've dealt with, resistance in various forms. The one that I'm most interested in is the one that involves the violence, that involves the bloodshed. There are some who refer to it as blood reparations. So sometimes we talk about reparations in cash. There are others who talk about, reparation in kind, the same way that the damage was done, then the reparation will be done in the same way. So, in terms of the resistance, we can name many names. Charles Deslonges, has anyone heard that name before? This is what's called the German Coast Uprising in Louisiana in 1811, one of the largest ones. People may have heard of Nat Turner. Anyone? All right, let's give that African a round of applause, Nat Turner. And then even some of the aborted ones like Denmark Vesey, like Gabriel Prosser, like Cujo in Jamaica, like Nani in Jamaica. Like we can go through a list, and that can be a libation in and of itself of just, it's a one body minimum. You gotta at least have a couple of bodies before we call your name in that libation. But yeah, so in terms of resistance, African people have been resisting, and if they didn't resist, we would still be in the same type of enslavement. What we did is we forced them into a different type. So they say, okay, now we got to come off of it and change the name. even in 1865, when they talk about the Civil War, that was one when Africans picked up the guns and started whooping the behinds of their former erstwhile enslavers. So we have to understand the role that there wouldn't be any Emancipation Proclamation or whatever. There wouldn't be even the 13th Amendment, which makes slavery have to transform without Africans getting up, shedding blood, taking lives, and doing things of that nature in order to restore balance into the world.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your talks and your answers so far today, or this evening. I agree with both of you, of course, that education is a key aspect to our liberation. I was at the talk with Uncle Corte at Legon University last week, and somebody asked a question I was planning to ask about education. As simple as it might seem to fix our education system, I can't remember the specifics of the question or the answer, but in general he said that there were some specific policies in place that made sure that even in Africa here we would know of Napoleon instead of knowing about Dessalines or Toussaint. We will know about Shakespeare instead of knowing about the Ayinkweyamars and the Ptah-hoteps. I feel like there's been a lot of work done making documentaries and books on things like how the prison system is, that you discussed in your presentation, Dr. Cameron. I don't feel there's, and I say a March 21 documentary on how aid forces, for instance, abortion clinics and so on, that kind of thing. But what I want to know now is, are there names or specific policies that these same aid organizations perhaps force or request in return for aid that make sure that the education we receive on the continent is still very Eurocentric, but we, as a result, lose our birthright in the process?
So we are taking the questions two at a time. Anybody?
Okay, in terms of aid, there are multiple conditionalities that come with that. One thing that we found in the Ghana curriculum in particular is that history is not taught, that what you have is social studies, and I've actually got a chance to peruse some of those books, and in them I've taken pictures, and you see write down which of these are the benefits of colonialism, right? I'll see another one is supposed to be religious and moral teachings, and it says which one, who is this? And it gives Jesus, Moses, or Muhammad, and it's Caesar Borgia, the white man, Pope Alexander VI, illegitimate son. So none of the above would be the right answer, but that's not it. You gotta choose that this is Jesus. So, and then I've also seen books that have been funded by U.S. aid that have been, tied to all these things. I'm not sure of any specific conditionalities that make that happen, or if it's just autopilot. We dumbed you down from colonial times. You don't know anything, how are you going to teach somebody something? But I will say that what we've done in response to that, or just of our own initiative, is to homeschool our own children. So we have a collective of people who we just do what we think is correct. So we're teaching our children in indigenous languages about this exact same information that we're talking about here, about the ancient texts that we're saying that we should go back, about our African worldview, the concept of the human being, all these things. So, it comes to a point of we can wait for the government to magically come down from the sky like the golden stool, and now they've bequeathed a good curriculum, even though they don't know the information that we're saying that they should teach, or we can take it into our own hands. And then as some of our students get into those positions, that now they know something. A student who's been informed of this information isn't going to allow, this, that, and the third to go through. So again, I don't know specific policies and conditionalities with regard to the miseducation and diseducation system. I wouldn't doubt it. Or it could just be on autopilot that we dumbed you down from colonial times. At what point, they say garbage in, garbage out. At what point in time are you going to magically produce a diamond when all I've shoved down your throat has been fecal matter?
Well, thank you. I am frightened by the number of so-called NGOs that we have in Africa and the so-called third world today. I remember mid-90s, I think 96, 97, there were over 400 non-governmental organizations on the ground here in Ghana. And people started asking questions. Was it an indication of failure of state? Was the state being relegated to the background? Because most of these NGOs are funded from outside. And once they are being funded from outside, they are tied to the dictates of the funding community. And I think some of these NGOs have done things that are inimical to the growth and emancipation of this country, because the funding authorities are not necessarily interested in developing the country. And people have raised suspicion about the fact that the new medium through which Africa can be controlled is to make central government dysfunctional, and they have all kinds of allies in central government itself. But then through NGOs, Africa will continue to be controlled. I don't know how far that is true, but I'm saying that if you do an audit of all these NGOs, maybe just 5% of them are genuine, and doing something to turn things around economically, socially, or whatever for the people. And I also remember that at the Maastricht Treaty, again in the mid-90s, when aid to Africa was tied to democratization, that time we had a lot of military regimes still active on the continent, that you had to democratize. And where democratization means going to the polls every 4 years and electing, whether the election was free, fair, and transparent or whatsoever, as far as you go through the ritual, then you are practicing democracy. And I remember very well, at an international forum, a professor from Liverpool University raised the question that, look, you cannot tie aid to anything. You just want to help people to help themselves, or forget about it. You cannot sit in Washington, Paris, the so-called Paris Club and whatsoever, and dictate to people in the third world how they should use money. For all you know, what you want them to use the money for is not their first priority. And he gave this example that the most vibrant economies at the time were those that were superintended by very dictatorial governments. He mentioned the Arab states, those that we are too happy to program, Qatar, Kuwait, and the so-called Asian tigers at the time. According to that professor, they were being run by non-democratic, or governments that are anything but democratic. So where lies the correlation between democracy, the way the West is selling it to Africa? Of course, in places like Togo, Gabon, after 4 years there will be elections, and the young man will clock 99.9% of the votes, and there will be applause in Paris because a stooge, a puppet somewhere, is doing the bidding of some metropolitan power somewhere, and then in that, once that continues, the stranglehold of the so-called metropolitan powers will continue in Africa. So I think again it's a learning experience for us. Whether we are learning from these things or not, I'm not too sure. But you raise a very legitimate question. Thank you.
I'm still sort of constructing my question in my head, so please give me a second. It's, I think, mainly to do with also accessibility to information, because I'll give you an example. I'm an architect, and studying architecture in an African school of architecture, we were taught about the German Mies van der Rohe, we learned about Le Corbusier, we learned about Walter Gropius, and these are all Western architects. But it was only when we started doing our own research that we found out about the Imhoteps, that we found out about more recent names like Demis Norco from Nigeria, who's done amazing things. And so that was an exclusive space, like the exclusive circles of academia, that we already had that deficiency, of like that lack of access to information. So even in these spaces of privilege, we had that deficiency, fine. But then also, then even coming outside that, how do we then begin to have that dialogue outside those spaces, even in spaces where actually mental slavery and mental liberation exist more so sometimes than in these circles of academia, right? So how do we ensure that this dialogue sort of moves out of the spaces that some like I may be accustomed to, and ensure that we are, like, how do we change the form of this dialogue so that it's beyond the spaces of just, well, not just, but me now being stuck with Le Corbusier versus Demis Norco. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, again, that dialogue can happen at the level of some intellectual engagement between the African intellectual community and whatever you're talking about. And this is what Ngugi, for instance, talks about when he came up with this idea of moving the center. We are in Africa, you are an architect by training or a student of architecture. And at a certain level, Africans think, for instance, that a mark of development of civilization is to build high rises in our capital cities. Some Manhattan or whatever, whether it is appropriate to our condition or not, we are not interested. We just want to copy blindly. We cannot maintain 4-story structures in Africa. If you install an escalator, it will break down in 2 weeks. But some time ago, people say, oh, when you go to this place, this doesn't look like a city. We don't have any high rises. As if that is all that architecture is about. And I'm saying that if you move the center, the way Ngugi is saying it, moving the center means thinking from within and then engaging with the outside, but not starting from outside, inflicting something that is mutually exclusive to your condition, and then begin to suffer. So I think architecture is a very good area to start this dialogue. Do we need high rises? And the way we build, I am suffering in my house now because of poor ventilation. I saw sliding windows all over the place, and I told my wife, oh, why don't we do this? Then we had to install an AC. But it's not good for me. Even that, there is poor ventilation. Do you understand me? So I think moving the center, thinking from within, and then engaging with the outside intellectual community, I think that's the best way for me to go.
Yeah, I would definitely second that. I'm actually in the process of building my own home. I have a wonderful architect named Juonu Sefogan, and we are doing an octagon-shaped house made of mud brick, and basically looking at various things in terms of solar, in terms of water catchment systems. But I bring that up because as we're doing it, a lot of the considerations was sliding windows are not an option. Right off the bat, we're constructing it in such a way so that the ventilation system, so looking at how African people indigenously worked out these things, because, even the mud brick has properties that's able to, keep it cool during the day, keep it warm at night. So all of these things, so looking at African indigenous knowledge in order to, build, even when we talk about, Africans, do this or do that, I would say we even have to interrogate the degree to which we would say that that's what Africans do. If you were African, you wouldn't be doing that. That's what anti-Africans do. And anti-Africans are manufactured in these same schools that we're talking about here. So how do I produce someone who does things that are only beneficial to Eurasians and nothing that's beneficial to African people, who has created tastes and desires? I always give this quote from the oldest book, The Instructions of Ptah, where it says, "One who listens to his belly belongs to the enemy." One who listens to his belly belongs to the enemy. This is just short of 5,000 years ago. Your African ancestor wrote that down so that you would know that if you just have a taste for high rises or whatever, KFC, Pizza Hut, whatever they bring to you, you're just like, I want more, then you're listening to these created tastes and desires and you're already their property, right? So, in terms of moving it out of these spaces, the internet is available. I have a website called Abibitumi Casa that has several thousand members. We're coming up on 11 years old now, and this is what we deal with. Another issue is that the platforms that we discuss African liberation on are all white owned. So whether it's Facebook, whether it's WhatsApp or whatever, so I divested from those. I stopped commenting on anything on YouTube. I said, I'm divesting from all this whiteness. I gave a talk called Make Africa Great Again. Divest from America, invest in Africa. So I think that, we have spaces where people have open access to this to the degree which, my builder has a smartphone. He could access this information, but you have to spark something off in him to get that. What's sparked off in everybody now is let me like something on Facebook, let me, do whatever on Instagram. I don't even know what you do on there because I've never used that. Let me tweet, I know that one exists. So, we have to just even take advantage of what's already there. Everything that I've said here is readily available on the internet. There are Wikipedia pages about this stuff. You understand? That's how, and that's the cesspool of, white hegemony of knowledge, right? But you can even find it there. So, in the same time, and it's like the thing that people say in terms of physics, that two things can't be in the same place at the same time, that you can't be spending all of your energy making Mark Zuckerberg rich and at the same time say, I'm trying to build up Africa, that at the same time you're liking something on, I don't even know what people are liking now, on some viral video is the time that you could be researching about who is this great African architect, who's Joe Saado with his house here in Accra, what type of techniques is this African using? I looked at a documentary called First Earth, where it starts off in Africa, showing all these people throughout the world who are building with earth. So it goes into Africa, it goes into Yemen, the skyscrapers that they build with earth. It goes into the US from adobe bricks to modern things in Seattle and Canada. It goes into Southeast Asia, where they didn't really use it that much, but they used to use bamboo. They're switching to earth. So if you are interested and someone has sparked this off in you, now the rest is just like you're saying, your own. My father always said, never let school get in the way of your education. I'll leave it with that.
Last question, and then we can wrap up. We've had some really insightful conversations, but we haven't really talked about women in connection with the issue of liberation and revolution. And I particularly want to mention Laura Adoko-Kofi. I don't know how many of you have heard about Laura Adoko-Kofi. So Laura's father was king of Sempe, which is it's like a 5-minute walk from here, actually. In 1917, she migrated to the U.S. And started a repatriation movement in the South, particularly. through Denver, Mississippi, and in particularly places that the UN, Marcus Garvey's UNI were not strong or were not present. She went on